Hello, and welcome again to another module here in our class on the foundations of moral theology. And what we need to do basically in this week is to finish up our look at our Aquinas' ethics textbook. And also I want to cover a few more topics related to contemporary debates about natural law that I think will be important for us to have under our belts as we head into the second half of the course, where we're going to be looking at some of the contemporary debates about ethics, particularly in the fields of sexual ethics and medical ethics. And given the timing of things, I thought it might be more helpful to go ahead and address some of those issues, and then we will hold off on wrapping up our discussion of the textbook to the next module. So I will post a couple of readings for you on Blackboard dealing with some of the topics for this module, brief readings, and some excerpts from some of the people we're going to be talking about. But if you read through those, which you should be able to do, you can certainly continue on the Aquinas textbook because we will be returning to that to talk about that third and final section in Module 6. But for today, as you can see here, we're going to go through a number of different topics, beginning with the issue of physicalism. And I want to introduce you to some of the primary objections or arguments raised about natural law in the realm of Catholic ethics today, so that, again, you can be familiar with them as we head into the specific issues in coming weeks. And really, we're going to focus here on debates taking place within the realm of Catholic ethics. Obviously, there are a whole range of people, a whole range of schools of thought that would disagree with natural law or with Catholic ethical teaching in the larger academic, cultural realm. And we'll look at some of the opposing ethical systems, again, in some future modules. But for today, for this module, I want to focus on kind of internal Catholic debates about natural law ethics and Catholic ethics as a whole. And obviously, if you know anything about natural law and the debates about it, you will know that there's a reason why we begin with sexual ethics and medical ethics, because many of the disagreements or dissenting opinions really focus on those topics, and that's really where they focus their disagreement and kind of formulate their disagreement with the natural law tradition. And that's certainly true with this first topic I want to look at, which is namely the charge of physicalism. Right, so one of the arguments used by some Catholic ethicists in their opposition to the traditional natural law positions of the Church is that they contend that the Church's positions, traditional natural law, is excessively physicalist. Okay, well, what do they mean by that? Well, if you'll think back to our introduction to natural law theory, right, it's based on the nature of the human person. And we argued that from a Catholic perspective, from a traditional Christian perspective, the human person is this combination of body and soul together, that the body is an essential part of the person. So if our natural law is based on our nature as persons, then that's going to include our bodily nature, right? And so one can look at, for instance, biology to determine some aspects of what natural law is. For example, human beings tend to be very weak and dependent in their infancy, and then also often in old age. And so that's part of our nature, right? And there's a corresponding component to natural law, namely that we have a moral obligation to care for, in a special way, the very young, and then also the very old or ill. There are other ways too, perhaps even more straightforward. For example, look, the human body processes alcohol in a certain way. And so once you get a certain amount of alcohol based on a person's constitution, it begins to impair the function of certain biological systems, primarily neurological systems, but others. And so from this biological reality of the human body, we can say that alcohol consumption past a certain point begins to impede the well-being of the body. And the body's ability to function properly. And so, in essence, if you go past that point, if you drink to the point of drunkenness, it's in many ways analogous to kind of bringing about a culpable ignorance, right? That you are putting yourself in a position where you might very well make some immoral choices. And while those choices in and of themselves might have reduced culpability because you can't think straight, and so you're not really rationally choosing to do a wrong, your culpability just comes in a step earlier, right? When you decided to put yourself in a position where you might be more prone to do immoral things. And all of that could be rooted, at least to a large extent, in our biological makeup, how our bodies handle alcohol. So those are just some pretty quick and straightforward examples. Obviously, in the realm of sexual ethics, human reproduction works a particular way, right? And from the perspective of natural law, it's not just an accident, it's not just an evolutionary chance product that human beings reproduce the way they do. In fact, it's God's design. And so that the design of our reproductive systems and the fact that you need a father and mother and the fact that children biologically do best when they have, two providers, all of these things are not just biological facts, but they also then lead to moral principles that we ought to follow. In fact, that children ought to be produced in this way, that children ought to be cared for within the context of this relationship between man and woman. And this is where we get to the debate about physicalism. Of course, as you probably all know, right, the landmark pivotal case when it comes to debates about sexual ethics in the Catholic Church is Humanae Vitae. And so when Humanae Vitae was put out by Paul VI, this sparked really a debate about Catholic sexual ethics that has been going on up to the current day. And many of the primary initial scholars and theologians who dissented from the teaching of Humanae Vitae focused on this idea of physicalism. And they argue that essentially what's happened here is that in thinking about the nature of the human person, excessive attention is being paid to purely biological facts. And they argue that this in fact gives a distorted view of the human person. And they would argue that really a better understanding of the human person is to focus on their spiritual and social and emotional well-being. And so that it can in fact be right and moral to carry out actions where kind of the typical textbook biological functions are restricted or impaired if that is going to bring about what they see as greater fulfillment or greater goods in terms of social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And this argument shows up in many, many different places. And really, if you look in any critiques within the Catholic world of Humanae Vitae, you'll probably find some form of this argument there. Perhaps the most famous person to make this argument is the theologian Charles Curran, who very publicly made this argument in his dissent from the Church's teaching in Humanae Vitae. He traces this back to, in fact, Aquinas, who he sees as having an excessive focus on the body, and argues that this comes from Aquinas' reliance on the Roman figure of Ulpian, who was a Roman jurist who wrote about law and about morals, and focused on man's biological animal nature as a guide for how one ought to live. Right? And so Curran's accusation is that Aquinas has picked up on this idea and allowed it to unduly influence his teaching on Christian morality, right? And essentially argues that this ends up producing a view of the human person which is basically an animal with kind of a rational soul on top, or a veneer of the soul, and so that it's really this biological animal nature that determines morality, with kind of lip service paid to the emotional, rational component of the human person. Now, having studied, to some extent at least, Aquinas' position, probably like me, you would not find this a terribly convincing portrait of Aquinas. But whether or not it's found in Aquinas or not, I don't think that's something that the dissidents or dissenters would really cling to. Their larger issue is, regardless of where it comes from, the Church's current teaching, they would say, is excessively focused on biology, right, and doesn't pay enough attention to the emotional, intellectual, social components of the human person. And they would argue that as human persons, our intellect, we are the kind of creatures where our intellect can in fact intervene and modify even our physical bodies and our physical makeup, and that's part of our nature. So they would say, really, a proper understanding of the human person would see the body as part of the picture, but not really a definitive part, that it's really the intellect, the will, in terms of pursuit of social and emotional well-being. That's really what defines the human person. Now, how ought one to respond to this? Well, you probably can tell I'm not terribly convinced by this argument on the side of the dissenters from the Church's teaching, in large part because in making this accusation, if it were true, it might make sense, right? That, look, the human person doesn't just consist of the body. It is important to consider the soul, the intellect, a person's social relationships as an important part of what constitutes the human person and the good of the human person. With that being said, if you argue that the body doesn't have any defining function in determining morality, it really becomes, in many ways, just really kind of a form of relativism in many ways, right? That, well, look, what ultimately becomes the standard for these figures, if we're not going to refer to, well, how the human body works, well, what leads to emotional well-being, what leads to emotional happiness? And it seems a very small step from there to, well, doing basically whatever it is that's going to make you happy is the right thing to do. So that seems to be becoming dangerously close to just a sort of utilitarianism or a sort of relativism, and it seems to really kind of cut out an essential part of what makes the natural law distinct as an ethical system. So this isn't just a kind of internal friendly amendment, if you will. This is really largely a rejection of natural law as a whole, or at least it would seem so to me. Now, with that being said, I do think there are some interesting questions to be raised here. That when we look at what is the role of the body in determining morality, I think while one doesn't necessarily have to agree with Charles Curran to say that this is at least a question worth considering. So, when we look at sexual ethics, obviously the argument is that sexual relations are by the design of the human body, aimed at procreation, right? And so the traditional Catholic teaching is that all kind of sexual relations must include that component, include the possibility or openness to procreation as kind of their final end in order to be moral, right? Okay, that certainly seems reasonable. But what happens when we raise the same sort of questions or look at the same sort of issues in relation to other bodily activities? So let's take, for example, eating, right? What is the biological purpose of eating? Well, the biological purpose of eating, it seems, is primarily to provide nourishment to maintain the health of the body, right? And so eating that contributes to the health of the body is moral. Eating that works against the health of the body, in fact, is immoral, right? So traditionally, the sin of gluttony is seen as a sin, right? This is eating that goes beyond what is good for the body and, in fact, begins to harm the good of the body, or at least some forms of gluttony harm the body by eating too much. And so, okay, this seems to parallel fairly well. But when we're going to look at very specific acts, right, just as people would do in terms of sexual ethics, is it the case that every act of eating, in fact, must contribute to the health of the person in order to be moral? Right? So this is the argument that's raised in regard to sexual activity. But what about when it comes to eating? Let's say a person, has a chance to eat a bonbon or a Reese's peanut butter cup or whatever it is that you find kind of a particularly desirable candy or dessert or whatever it might be. And let's assume that you're a relatively healthy person, and this would just be, a moderate dessert, right? This is something that your body does not need in order to maintain your health. And in fact, if you were going to look at it, very carefully, right, that this particular instance, these are excess calories for you for that day. So in some really minimal way, eating this peanut butter cup would probably actually take away slightly from your overall health. Now, here's the question, right? Is it moral to eat that peanut butter cup? And really here, it seems to me that it could be moral, right, to eat the peanut butter cup. In fact, because eating doesn't just have one purpose. Eating has a purpose of also the enjoyment that we take from eating, right? That God made things taste good, and He inspired the good people at Reese's to combine chocolate and peanut butter in a way that is particularly good. And so just the pleasure of eating can, in fact, be a legitimate reason for eating a peanut butter cup, even if it's not going to contribute to my health, and even if it might, in some infinitesimal way, work against my overall health. So then, obviously, if you're thinking about this, you can see where this is going. The question then is, well, there's a couple questions. First, am I right about eating the peanut butter cup? And it just doesn't seem to be the case to me that it would be immoral to do that. And it doesn't seem to be part of the church's general teaching that sort of thing would be immoral. But perhaps I'm wrong about whether it's moral or not to eat that peanut butter cup. If we assume that it could be moral to eat the peanut butter cup or the bonbon, this then raises the question of how is the reproductive system, sexual activities, how do they differ from digestive system, from eating? What is the distinction there, which says in the one case, if the overall final end of that activity isn't included, it's immoral, but in this case, we can have eating without the final end of promoting physical health, and yet it's still moral. And I think that actually is a fairly interesting question, and we will talk about it more in the coming weeks, but it was something I wanted to propose for you to think about here in the meantime. So that's an introduction to this argument about physicalism, so at least you understand what this charge is, that is primarily focused on debates about sexual ethics, and whether or not physicalism in its popular form is persuasive. I do think there are some interesting questions to ask about how biology relates to morality along the lines of eating the peanut butter cup. So we will leave that now for the time being, and then go ahead and turn to our next topic on the next page. All right, that was a surprisingly long segment on physicalism, so I was kind of surprised myself when I ended that and saw how long it was. But we will have relatively few pages, so if you'll bear with me, we'll get through this module without it taking hopefully too much of your life away. But now that we've looked at physicalism, I want to turn and look at really the other kind of primary opposition to traditional natural law teaching in the Catholic Church. And that's the school of thought known as proportionalism. So proportionalists are Catholic ethicists who see themselves as part of the larger Catholic ethical tradition, but they disagree in a number of important ways with the traditional Catholic natural law, tradition that traces itself back to Aquinas and is currently argued for by people like May and others, Finis and Grisey, and people that we've referred to in the last few modules. All right, so what are the proportionalists, or who are the proportionalists, and what is it that they are arguing? Proportionalism is, again, it's a whole school of thought within the field of Catholic ethics, so we can't really do it true justice in a single page of our module here. There are a couple really key ideas I think that we can focus on as being distinctive about proportionalism. The first is this idea of shifting away from a focus on individual acts, right? So proportionalism really wants to, the fundamental disagreement with natural law is to say that they disagree with this focus on individual acts and focusing our discussion of morality on individual acts, which then go on to form habits and virtues and the overall good of the person. Right? They want to shift perspectives basically and begin with whether the overall person is moral or immoral, and then situate the individual acts kind of within that broader context. So it's the overall good or evil of the person that they want to see as the primary consideration, and then the acts kind of fit into this broader perspective. And so this comes up sort of technically in working out their ethics in a couple of important ways. The first is in their focus on this idea of a fundamental option or fundamental choice that the person makes. Right? So from the traditional natural law perspective, what determines if you are a good person or a bad person? Well, Aquinas would say, look, do you fulfill the capacities, the natural capacities of the kind of being you are well or not? And if you don't, then you are a bad human being. If you do it well, you are a good human being. Okay, well, how do we determine if you're doing that well or poorly? Well, you look at how those capacities have been developed, right? And the capacities are developed by the individual acts that a person performs. And if you perform good acts, you will strengthen and develop your capacities. If you do bad acts, it will go the opposite direction. And it really comes down to these individual acts either work towards making you a good person or work towards making you not a good person, right? So for the proportionalists, they would say we need to get away from looking at these acts and look at what kind of person has this person decided to become, right? So it's not really a question of saying, look, we have this standard of what a good human person is, and then we're going to see whether or not you meet that, and you meet that by performance of acts that fit this standard or don't fit this standard. Instead, the proportionalists will argue that, well, what determines a good human person? Well, a good human person is one who enacts their freedom and seeks the good and seeks to be a good person, right? So they will move away, subtly or not so subtly, from this idea of there being a standard, right? And it becomes much more a vision of the human person as the kind of being who is free to determine what kind of being they're going to be, right? And if you fundamentally decide that you are going to be a good person, well then, to a large extent, that's what you are. You become a good person. Now, I'm making it sound a little more maybe wishy-washy than they would present it in their writings, and I'll give you some excerpts from someone who falls into this camp, so you can read for yourself how it's presented. But that's essentially the idea of it, right? We're going to get rid of this idea of there being a standard that we measure ourselves against. And as you might guess, as a quick aside here, proportionalism tends to go along with a criticism of traditional natural law as physicalist, right? So they would say the traditional view of what the human person is or ought to be is too static, it's too fixed. That the human person is really much more dynamic, and that what constitutes the good of the human person, for example, in the 21st century, might be very different than what constituted the good of the person in the 13th century when Aquinas is writing. right? That part of human nature is to evolve and develop and to open up new spheres of meaning and relationship. And so if you seek to be a good person and act on your freedom and pursue this good, well, then you have you've taken your fundamental option. You've made a fundamental choice for the good, and that's what defines your overall character. Now, your actions then should more or less, fit this fundamental choice to be good. Now, some individual actions may not fit there, but that's not really what matters, right? What really matters is this fundamental option, this fundamental choice that you make. That's really where our focus should be, not so much on the individual acts. Okay, so that would be the first big component of proportionalism, right? This focus on, do I choose to be a good person? And if so, if I honestly really, think about the meaning of my life, think about what my goals are, what I ought to do, and I choose to do that, well then that basically does make me in fact a good person. Now, let's say, okay, that's all sounds very nice and good, but what about the individual acts? Doesn't this still mean, isn't this person still going to do some wrong acts along the way, and wouldn't that actually make you not such a good person? So there does need to be a consideration then of the good of individual acts. And as you might guess, right, the proportionalists are going to say that some kinds of actions that are seen as more or less always immoral from a traditional natural law perspective can in fact be moral if they're part of this life that's seeking fundamentally the good. Well, how do they make that argument, right? And this is where the other big component of proportionalism comes in. They're going to use something that they see as analogous to, or really a development of, the principle of double effect. And they're going to what they basically do, and again I'll give you an excerpt so you can read for yourself, is to take the first three criteria of the principle of double effect and kind of bracket them, right, and say what really matters is that fourth one. Is there an overarching good or a proportionate reason, right, which is where the name of the school of thought comes from? Is there a proportionate reason for doing this act, even though it's the kind of act which we normally would say people generally ought not to do? So if there is a proportionate reason, one that fits into this fundamental goal that I've set for myself of being a particular type of good person, if in this particular instance there is a big enough benefit in terms of becoming that kind of person that I want to be, then any individual act could in fact be made moral, right? And along with these kind of general principles, proportionalists also reject the idea of there being moral absolutes, like we talked about last time, right? They would say there are no actions that we could say would always be wrong, right? Because what determines what's right or wrong is not some fixed standard of human nature. It is in fact this defined goal that we have for ourselves, right? And that when we combine that with particular circumstances, there's no way that we can say ahead of time that in any given circumstance a particular action won't help a person get towards what their fundamental choice of the good is, what their goal is as a person. So there could be situations where any particular kind of action would in fact be moral. So again, they would say, well, this isn't utilitarianism, this isn't relativism, because we are still being guided by this fundamental goal that we have set for ourselves. And so there still is a standard, but the standard here has become something that we more or less determine for ourselves. Now, obviously, again, I'm kind of tipping my hand pretty blatantly here. I think that this ultimately just collapses into another form of utilitarianism or relativism, in that if it makes me happy, ultimately, then it's okay or moral. And they would disagree and say that there are still standards that have to be followed. But when you get down to it, and they will say this themselves, with proportionalism, no matter what the action might be, it's at least conceivable for them that there could be some circumstance where that act would in fact be moral. And that's just ultimately, I think, not compatible with really any kind of sense of an objective standard of morality, and that ultimately collapses into a type of relativism. But again, they would disagree. But I think it's important to, again, give you this very brief introduction to what proportionalism is, because this is really the primary Catholic opposition to natural law theory. Right? So when you read about debates, and you will read about debates, particularly in regard to sexual ethics and medical ethics, this is the kind of argument that's put forward. Right? They will say, well, this isn't really about a rejection of marriage or a rejection of kind of any traditional Christian teachings. But what we need to do is to look at, well, what's the nature of 21st century American life? And what's going to really fulfill emotionally and socially and intellectually people in this setting? And what if there are people in this setting who have honestly chosen and have reflected on themselves and really thought about themselves and their faith, and they've really determined that the best thing for them, the right thing for them to do is to do X, to enter into homosexual marriage or to use contraception or whatever the case might be. They will argue that, given their fundamental choice of the good, given that in this case, this is really going to contribute to this good that they're seeking for themselves, that constitutes then a proportionate reason for saying that in this circumstance, this act is moral for them, even if traditional natural law teaching would say this is kind of action that doesn't fit with the true nature of the human person. And so that debate between traditional natural law and proportionalism is really going to be shaping the debates in a lot of the specific issues that we're going to be looking at in the coming weeks. So this is kind of a general introduction to that, and we will flesh out a lot of these details, and you'll see in action how these arguments work in the coming weeks. The last topic that I wanted to look at to kind of round out our introduction to some of the key issues in natural law, and in particular in the debates going on within Catholic ethics today, is the issue of church authority. Really all of this has been kind of a prequel to some of the specific debates we're going to get in the coming weeks. So you need to know what physicalism is, you need to know what proportionalism is, and obviously another thing that's going to come up quite a bit in these debates that's not really covered extensively in the textbook is going to be the issue of church authority, right? Because we're going to have a couple different arguments going on when we look at these particular debates. There's going to be the argument about the moral decision-making process, right? So what's going to determine our moral principles and how do they apply in particular cases? And that's one argument, obviously, that's going to happen in all these different areas, and it's going to be proportionalism versus natural law versus utilitarianism. But there's also a related kind of secondary argument going on here as well in the realm of Catholic ethics, right? And that is, what is the proper role of the Church's teaching authority and the proper relationship of individual Catholics and Catholic theologians and scholars to that teaching authority? And obviously this is, again, a very hotly contested issue, right? And there are two camps, right? And as you might not be surprised to learn, those theologians who are proportionalists and who accuse traditional natural law of being excessively physicalist, they tend to view the Church's teaching authority as occupying some sort of legitimate role, but as being one that is not very binding in any meaningful way on individual Catholics, and certainly not on theologians, right? And so they would argue, analogously to their understanding of the human person, that just like the human person can develop and change, and what fulfills it now might be different than what fulfilled it centuries ago, again, they're going to see the Church's teaching authority in similar light. that yes, at various times the church's teaching authority is going to be helpful and to clarify things, but we can't be locked into any particular formulation, and there needs to be a lot of room for dynamic growth and development. And they will argue that when we look at the church's teaching, particularly in recent years, and particularly looking at like Humanae Vitae, for example, they would say that the church's teaching authority has been too rooted to tradition, too rooted in trying to impose the morals and view of human nature from earlier centuries on this dynamic 21st century reality. And so while they would say, yes, the magisterium is a legitimate part of church life, they are going to be very willing to disagree privately and publicly with that magisterium based on their conception of what constitutes the true good of people based on proportionalism and this view of the dynamic nature of the human person. Now, obviously, those who follow the more traditional natural law teaching tend to have a different perspective and tend to see human nature as being relatively static, and that is going to mean that the church's teaching about human nature, while there certainly will be developments, there can certainly be clarifications, is going to be pretty steady, right? And that's going to mean that the church's tradition, the church's teaching of morals over the centuries is going to be a fairly reliable body of norms and principles and teachings that we can draw on. Right, so you can see how this fundamental different view of human nature translates into different attitudes towards the church's teaching authority. Now again, this is a huge debate, and there are countless books and articles written on it. In a nutshell, I would argue that the dissenting view of the magisterium is in many ways like the view of natural law, right? That if we are going to say, well, yes, there is a proper role for the church's teaching authority, but not when it conflicts with my current understanding of what constitutes human good, you've really reduced the role of the teaching authority of the church to just kind of a figurehead. And essentially, it's not clear how a Catholic theologian who holds those positions is really in any essential way different from a Protestant theologian. There really is no distinctive connection with the church's teaching authority in many of the scholars who would fall into that kind of proportionalist camp. Because anytime the church's magisterium disagrees with the positions they hold, the immediate assumption is that the magisterium is wrong and not vice versa. Right? Now, from the traditional perspective, obviously they're going to see things very differently, and they're going to treat the church's teaching authority as a much more reliable guide. Now again, kind of like with the physicalism last time, I certainly think the dissenters are off base, at least from my perspective. But I do think that there are questions, and we don't want to necessarily completely dismiss the issues that they raise. Right? So it is important when we go into this discussion of these controversial topics to recognize that there are some nuances to the church's teaching authority. And so actually there are a couple points I want to make. First is that one of the points of studying ethics formally, academically like this, is to make sure that we can provide a reason for the positions that we hold that aren't based solely on authority. Right? So even if the church clearly teaches a position on some controversial issue, we shouldn't just end there and say, well, look, this encyclical says this, or this pontifical decree says this. We should be able to give a reason for that, and a reason which the church says is going to be rooted in natural law. And that's, very scriptural, right? That we're admonished to be able to give an account of our faith to others. So even with accepting the church's teaching authority, it's still important to be able to explain why the church teaches the way it does. The second is that there are, in fact, different levels of teaching authority, different degrees of authority for different pronouncements and teachings. And it's important to remember this, particularly at the kind of two ends of the spectrum. Right? Now, clearly there are some teachings that are infallible, and that we are, in fact, bound by Catholics to assent to and agree with. Right? So these fundamental truths of the faith, fundamental moral principles, are infallible, right? And this is going to include the decrees of the ecumenical councils. It's going to include ex cathedra statements from the Pope, and it's also going to include what's taught by the universal magisterium, right? So many of the moral principles that would be considered infallible by most Catholic theologians are not in an ecumenical council's decrees or canons. There's no ex cathedra statement from the Pope. It's simply a moral principle that has been taught universally throughout the church, throughout the different ages of the church. And so that constitutes a teaching as infallible, in addition to those other methods that we focus on in church history class. Now, the number of infallible church teachings is going to be limited. This doesn't cover everything really in our faith, certainly by any stretch of the imagination. There are two other levels of authority as well, right? So there are some teachings which are kind of at the other end of the spectrum, which are prudential judgments, right? So these are kinds of teachings that are focused on applying Catholic moral principles to specific situations. So, for example, when the U.S. bishops put out a document on homelessness in America, right? They're typically going to include recommendations about how to address this problem. Right now, as Catholics, Catholics ought to greet the Church's teaching, whatever level of authority it might be given on, with respect, right? And begin with an attitude of acceptance, right? That we should go into reading and understanding this teaching kind of with the presupposition that we are going to accept it, right? Because as Catholics, we believe that the Holy Spirit really does guide the Church's teaching in a way that's going to not just preserve it from error, but that's also going to help us attain salvation. Now, with that being said, right, when the churches, when the U.S. bishops or individual bishops give recommendations for dealing with a specific, concrete social problem, what they are doing is making a prudential judgment about this situation based on the Church's principles. And again, while we should presume that we might or will agree with this, it is at the same time permissible to disagree with those prudential judgments if we have serious reasons for doing so. So we might see the Church's recommendations on homelessness. We need to take them seriously, really consider them. But when it comes to those sort of prudential judgments, we might honestly be convinced that there is a better way of dealing with homelessness than that outlined by the bishops, right? And as Catholics, we are free to disagree on those kinds of prudential judgments. Now, in between those prudential judgments and infallible teachings, right, there's another kind of level of teachings, if you will, which are authoritative but reformable, right? So there are teachings which are more universal, if you will, than kind of specific prudential judgments, but they aren't infallible teachings of the Church like the basic components of our faith and morals are. And these are things that could, in fact, be reformed, that could be developed or could be changed. So, for example, for many centuries, right, one famous example is the Church forbid the collection of interest, right? It forbid all loaning for interest as usury, and that as being immoral. Well, obviously that is no longer the Church's teaching. But that wasn't simply a prudential judgment in a particular time and place. That was a consistent Church teaching for quite a long period of time. But it was not kind of a fundamental truth of the faith or of morals. Right? The underlying principle is still there, right? That we shouldn't treat our fellow man as a means to an end, which was really the problem with usury, right? That you are taking advantage of a poor brother or sister by charging them interest, which was seen as kind of debilitating to that person and would prevent them from really flourishing as a person. And that's why usury was forbidden, why any interest was forbidden for so long. But with the development of modern economic systems, it became clear that while there certainly could be situations where charging interest harmed the other person, in a kind of capitalist economy, there can be situations where loaning money to someone, even including charging an interest on that loan, could in fact be to that person's benefit, that they could use that money to then maybe not just support themselves, but maybe get in a position where they were no longer dependent on someone else, where they could be in fact self-sufficient, so that that loan, even with interest, could be for their good. And so this is a change that occurs over centuries, where there has been a real kind of reform or development in the church's teaching on that matter. So there is this kind of middle level as well. Now, obviously there's going to be a great deal of debate about any particular controversial teaching and where it falls in that spectrum. And that's a debate that has to happen kind of on a case-by-case basis. But I think it is important to acknowledge, while we certainly don't want to basically get to the point where we can dissent from whatever we want to note that it's not the case that the opposite is what we want to uphold. There are, in fact, different levels of teaching authority, and so when we go to look at some of these controversial issues, we need to bear in mind that even if there is a teaching on a particular topic, we need to think about what kind of teaching is that. Is it an infallible one? Is it authoritative or reformable? Or is this just a prudential judgment about a specific situation? And that's going to shape how we respond to that and how we think about it as Catholics. All right, so we will conclude things at that point for now then. And in the next module, we will go back to our textbook and conclude with the final section there as well.